All right, we're going to get started. So, hello everyone, and thanks very much for joining us today for the fourth edition of Ask an Expert webinar series hosted by Marine Renewables Canada, or MRC, as many of you know us by. Our webinar today is going to focus on offshore wind and the essential need for coexistence with other ocean users and uses. So, as the interest in offshore wind increases in Canada, we know that it's very crucial for this industry to understand potential impacts, plan thoughtfully, and also engage early with other ocean users. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Elisa Oberman, and I'm the Executive Director at MRC, and I'm going to be your host for today. Many of you are already aware that we are the National Industry Association for Tidal, Offshore Wind, Wave, and River Current Energy, and we've been hosting these webinars with experts from all over the world to tackle Canadians' biggest questions about offshore wind. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment with all of you to recognize and acknowledge the traditional territories and Indigenous peoples of the different lands that we are all on today. So in particular, given that we're coming together to discuss offshore wind, I do invite all of us to think about the impacts that renewable energy projects can have on Indigenous communities and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures to ensure that marine renewable energy projects move forward both inclusively and respectfully. Before turning over to our expert guest today, just a few housekeeping notes. So we are recording this webinar and it will be posted on MRC's website as well as our YouTube page. If some of you have joined us in the past, you'll know that most of the webinar is focused on a presentation and then it will be followed by a Q&A. So the intention of our webinar series is really to respond to your questions and to provide education and information. So I encourage you to ask many questions while we have our expert with us. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And in terms of how to ask those questions, you can use the Q&A function or the chat, which I'll try to monitor both. And we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. If we can't get to some, occasionally what we try to do is answer some of the questions that we can and provide a bit of a follow-up email to everybody that's joined. So now I would like to welcome our expert guest speaker, who we are very pleased to have here with us today. So Alison Bates is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Colby College in Maine. And Dr. Bates researches social acceptance of renewable energy systems and implements an equity and justice framework to inform decision-making in the energy transition. Her research includes multiple technologies, including offshore wind, but also community solar, post-disaster energy grid resilience, and energy efficiency. So more recently, she has been focusing on floating wind development and the possibilities for technical solutions to social challenges with floating wind. So thanks very much, Alison, for being here. I think we can get started, so I'll just turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I can't see you, but I trust that you can see, we'll be able to see my screen in just a moment here. Thanks for that great introduction. I'm going to be sharing kind of a snapshot of some of the research that I've been involved with that is starting to bring different communities of people together, including fishing communities, to think about what are the next steps now that we're moving forward in really tangible ways with offshore wind development. So we'll get started by setting some context of what's happening with offshore wind in the US, which is where I'm located. I've been working on offshore wind in the US for, almost 15 years now, from the mid-Atlantic and now in the Gulf of Maine. So I'll just provide a very short snapshot of that context, and then some of the research that has sort of gotten us to where we are, and now that we're thinking about conflicts with on-water communities, and in particular fishing communities. So that's really where I will focus. And then I'll end my slides with some thoughts about what are our next steps, and how can we start to move forward rather than just looking at all of the problems. What are some of our areas of solutions? So I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share, and we'll get started with that. All right. I trust that that is working okay. Somebody holler out if it's not. So the title of the webinar, Lessons Learned and Best Practices for Coexistence with Other Ocean Users. You know, I'm not sure that we've gotten to best practices yet, but I think we're getting there, and I'm excited to share some of my work and some thoughts about this. So as you may be aware, I don't know how closely everyone here follows what's been happening in the US, but offshore wind has been moving forward over the past really 2 decades, but we're just now starting to install turbines in the water. Most of the installation has concentrated on the eastern seaboard, so not so much in the Gulf of Maine, but once we get sort of southern New England and down into the mid-Atlantic, we have very high wind speeds, which also pairs well with our energy load centers. So this is where the focus has mostly been, although there are other regions of the US that are moving forward with offshore wind leasing. A number of barriers have been identified.
Have you told them that there's a 404?
A number of barriers have been identified. In the US, these are common to many different regions. All right, certainly cost has been a barrier. Technology solutions, at least in deeper waters, has been a challenge. For example, floating wind. We're still looking at optimal solutions, and the technology readiness level is relatively low compared to more fixed-based turbine foundations. Environmental impacts, of course, have been at the forefront of a lot of the concerns that we've seen here in the US, and this is certainly true in Europe and other regions that have moved forward with offshore wind. There have been regulatory challenges, and the way that at least in the US, the way that our different agencies interact with one another, who has purview, who has responsibility over what. So that has taken time to sort that out. But really what I focus on are some of the social impacts. And in my opinion, although much of the research dollars has gone into lowering cost of offshore wind, I really view the social impacts as being the primary barrier to wide-scale deployment of offshore wind at scales that we have national targets for. So here in the US, we periodically release these maps that say, well, this is an area that we've prioritized for development. This is just a 3-panel map showing the eastern seaboard. This does get updated, over time, but this is just to give you a sense that most of our development, so here's Gulf of Maine. When this map was produced, there were no lease areas in the Gulf of Maine, but that is changing. We've concentrated in southern New England, and then there are many areas for leasing offshore wind as we move down the Atlantic seaboard. So that's just to give you a sense of where we're talking about offshore wind being concentrated. Now, this is the Gulf of Maine, and most of the work that I've been doing is really focused most recently on fishing communities in the Gulf of Maine. And I wanted to show this map for 2 reasons. One, to give you a sense of scale, but also to show you the process by which we have in the US identified where we're going to be leasing offshore wind. When I went out into the communities last summer to do some of my research, this map was brought up quite frequently. This was produced by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, and they're in charge of leasing in federal waters. And the reason that this is important is this entire green area was first produced as a potential area where offshore wind could be located. And when we start to talk with fishing communities about what it might mean to coexist, whatever that might mean, this was brought up as well. The entire Gulf of Maine is going to be developed, right? So there's a perception that comes with maps when they're produced this way, and that does make it challenging when we're trying to come up with solutions. Now, this area has been sort of iteratively winnowed down, right? So as there's been engagement processes, that area got smaller and smaller. And then just very recently, the federal government has identified these 8 areas in the Gulf of Maine as eligible for commercial leasing. And there's public comment period where people can sort of weigh in on some of those lease areas. And there's also this small area that has been identified by the state to conduct scientific research before we move into commercial development. So that is what's happening in this part of the country. We don't have any companies that are identified who will be actually associated with wind farms here, because we're not at that stage of leasing yet. But this sort of iterative winnowing down process has been at the forefront of a lot of the public discussions about what it means to have coexistence. And that's why I wanted to share that with you. So here in Maine, when we talk about coexistence with fishing communities, lobstering comes up almost immediately. This is a really important economic driver in the state. It's culturally important. It's financially important. It's linked to tourism, a lot of revenue. Also, coastal communities have really strong ties to the fishing industry. So we think about fishing heritage, we think about supply chain. People have a lot of empathy for fishing families and fishing villages. So this is something that is very much at the forefront when we're talking about coexistence. And fishing-dependent communities in Maine and in many other regions have concerns about offshore wind. Does this displace on-water activity? What does that mean for revenue? How might this hurt the ecological environment, which in turn is damaging to the resource? Feelings of threat and lack of agency and difficulty in participating in planning processes. These are all things that have come up that contribute to sort of this widespread concern that we might not be moving towards a place of coexistence. And I wanted to show you this picture because we've had a lot of organized protest here in the state from fishing communities against offshore wind for many of these reasons, right? These are sort of a broad brush idea, but we'll get into a little bit more nuance about that, and happy to answer any questions. But here you'll see there's some political influence here. We had opposing bills that went to the legislature, one to move forward with a procurement for offshore wind and one to ban all of offshore wind. And so this legislative bill LD 101 was meant to be a bill to ban all offshore wind in Maine. That was not passed by our legislature, but that was happening just a few years ago. So let's talk a little bit about coexistence and what do we mean by this? You know, when I think about coexistence, I typically think of being able to share ocean space in some way. And I think that one of the challenges in getting to what we might call coexistence is that we don't necessarily have a shared vision of what that looks like. So in fact, I don't have a neat definition for you. This is in fact something that we're still working on right now, is what does it really mean to have coexistence, right? Can we really share the ocean in a way that's acceptable to everybody? At a recent fishing industry trade show, we had a lot of pushback from participants in the fishing industry that this idea of what we call coexistence is not really possible. So I did want to note that the term coexistence here in Maine anyway is fraught and contested. And in the academic research community, we're sort of moving away from this term of coexistence and asking fishing communities what they see as the possibility for the future. So I wanted to note that. Sometimes we hear, we just want to be acknowledged that we're getting moved out of our fishing grounds. So what's next? That's not coexisting, that's doing something different. So I do think it's important to sort of level set when we're working with community members. So I'm going to share a little bit about my research now and talk about some of the social aspects of maybe why we might see such strong opposition, because it's not just about whether fishermen or others are moved out of ocean space, right? There's much more deep-rooted challenges that really need to be addressed if we're going to come to a place where we have sort of wide-scale agreement about how to move forward with offshore wind, and maybe then we can come up with a shared definition of what it might mean to coexist, or whatever you might call that. So I'll start with public opinion studies, and what we know about opposition or sort of coming along together for coexistence is really rooted in some attitudinal studies. And there's many studies, probably 20 years worth of studies, that have started to look into what are those nuanced issues. We used to call opposition to offshore wind NIMBY, or not in my backyard. I still hear that frequently, but researchers have largely moved away from that term because it devalues the true reasons for that, for people's concerns, right? It's okay to be concerned, to be supportive of offshore wind, to be concerned when it's in your local area, and valuing what those concerns are and really trying to understand those is really important. So we do know that most studies show that community members, when confronted with a wind farm that might be near them, are concerned with both physical attributes. So that might be aesthetics, that might be noise, maybe not so much with offshore wind, right? But what is the view shed? How big is it? How many wind turbines? As well as socially constructed attributes. And this is really important because we have found in many of our studies, including very recent studies with fishermen, that people hold a very strong cultural value of what the ocean landscape is and people's place-based identity associated with what is viewed as kind of the last frontier or very open space. Now, we can learn more about nuanced attitudes if we get into, particular wind projects. So we might take a wind farm that's proposed to be built, and we can ask questions like, how do perceptions, attitudes, and values shape public opinion of that wind project, right? So, for example, I did a study several years ago where we looked at proposed projects in New Jersey and in Delaware, and we were able to talk to people in our survey about the cost and talk about local benefits, which typically are unclear, right? So sometimes there's a mismatch of who bears the benefit, who gets the benefits and who bears the burden. But also, what is it going to look like? Because we hear a lot about aesthetics. And so we did these visual representations, and hopefully you can see this on your screen, where we simulated the actual wind farm that would be built. And so these are becoming more and more common, these sort of visual simulations. And so people could look at this from different angles. And then we had a number of survey questions. And what we're able to do with that information is identify, through different modeling, what are the things that are more likely to cause people to support the wind farm? And what are the things that are decreasing whether people might support the wind farm, right? So some of the takeaways I think are, where do you live? People who are more disconnected from ocean spaces tend to be much more supportive. Voting preferences tend to follow along political lines that sort of who's in power at the moment and what they're saying about climate or energy policies. We also see factors that decrease probability of support. Importantly, this sort of social construct where there's a very strong identification with the ocean. I also wanted to note that approximately 25% of people in this particular study who are not fishing members and their family members are not fishing community members say that user conflicts with offshore wind and fishermen is the most important reason that they're opposed to offshore wind overall. So this is important, I think, because we're seeing a lot of empathy, and these conflicts with fishing communities really resonates among coastal community members in the US anyway, okay? We also know that because communities are not monolithic, right? Project support or opposition is place dependent. So it's sometimes hard to draw these generalizations from one study to many studies because people have different constructs of what the ocean means to them. And it really is important to do community level studies if we want to have a baseline for where we are. I also wanted to note that here in Maine and in the US, both the cabling lines from a wind farm back to shore, as well as mooring lines, meaning mooring lines of a floating wind turbine, are very much contested right now. And I would say even more so than the arrangement of the wind farm, even more of a concern is going to be where are these cables coming to shore, and does that impact areas that might be either primary fishing grounds or potentially areas of beach areas of value or recreational value. And we conducted some interviews with folks, and people are very concerned about maybe how deep they're going to be. If there's a storm that comes, people said things like, heaven forbid there was an issue and the cables electrified the water. So this is an emerging issue that has continued to come up and has been of concern to folks. We asked in our study what people were concerned about with subsea cables, and people do mention sort of this harm for economic and recreational activities. But when we talk to fishermen specifically, what we're hearing is concern over electromagnetic fields. So buried cables do have an electromagnetic field around those. How might that impact some of the species? People are also worried about cooling water from substations, any heat coming off of subsea cables, and then of course gear interactions, which may not be a surprise. But these are some of the issues that are tending to come up in our public opinion studies. we wanted to look at whether opinions around offshore wind are really localized, or how much, if we did a study that was sort of transatlantic, do these attitudes resonate? And so very briefly, I'm working with a project on a project with a team over in France, where we look at two fishing community areas where there's kind of small scale floating wind farms that are either proposed or under development. And we looked at these in highly fishing dependent villages to see how the attitudes, are they similar, or are there differences? And just to give you a little context, this here is a map of the Gulf of Maine, and this is where we conducted our studies. And then if you're familiar with France, this is the French coastline, and these are some existing wind turbines that are either underway, floating wind turbines, or in development. And then these are proposed wind farms in the state of Maine. So we created some different visual mock-ups, and one of the things we wanted to look at was if we have these different types of structures that could be built into a floating wind turbine to increase the biodiversity benefits, right, that might be lost if you're having a fixed base structure, right? We tend to have habitat aggregation around those and more species there. And we tend to say, well, this is better for fishing because it's going to build in more fish population. It could be good for recreational, potentially good from spillover effects for commercial fishing. So does this change how people think about a wind farm if we have this, what we call artificial reef effect? And typically a floating turbine in deep waters is not going to have an artificial reef associated with it. So we've been working on some pilot designs to build these sort of intentional artificially constructed reefs that would be installed around the anchoring of a moored floating wind turbine. And so we shared some different data and information with people and talked to folks. And people are really interested in the increased habitat potential from a floating wind farm with an artificial reef attached. But in the US, we saw people being maybe more concerned with ecological risks, when in France, where they had experience with these floating wind farms, they were really concerned about both cost and maintenance, and as well, how people view government. So these are two different contexts, two different political contexts. And we noted that trust in institutions really varied. Typically, most people distrusted any solutions that would be led by industry, private industry. Trust in government was different country to country. And so I think that that is important context when we're looking at takeaways from other studies. But what we did find that was sort of across both regions is that there's a very clear role for boundary spanning institutions to play leadership roles in designing solutions. And I think that that's a really important takeaway. And that as we're thinking about moving forward in regions that don't have much development yet, what types of institutions and frameworks can we set up so that we're building trust early on rather than being reactive? Okay, so those are some of the attitudinal studies that I've worked on. And now that we have a sense of what some of the both physical and social constructs are, we wanted to look at how fishing how we might use information and data about where fishing is taking place, and can we use that to minimize conflict, right? So this is really like coexistence from the level of continue fishing where fishing is good, only build wind where wind is good, but let's try to avoid and minimize that conflict to the extent possible. Can we come up with ways to do that? And of course, there are ways, all of them are probably imperfect, but can we think about this in a way that's maybe a more equitable outcome? And so by minimizing spatial conflicts, we can clearly identify, right, areas where societal preferences can determine the best use of ocean space. That is where we have high conflict areas, but we might prioritize development in areas where we can see that there's low conflict, okay? So we've already established that there can be conflicts with offshore wind and commercial fishing. And I think, sort of used to say, well, this is really because there might be this exclusion zone. And I think in the coexistence space, there's two different sort of schools of thought about this. When we talk about coexistence, does this mean in a very large geographic area where one activity continues to happen and then the other activity happens over here? Or are we thinking about solutions where they can simultaneously use the same ocean space, right? And so that would be an important area to work on with the stakeholders, I think, in any given region. But I would say that overall, we tend to say there's going to be some sort of exclusion, whether it's mandatory, right? Here in the US, we don't have mandatory exclusion areas. We have what we might call a de facto exclusion. And all that means is many fishing vessels feel that they won't be able to continue their activities, at least not in the same way, once a wind farm is built, due to some of the myriad of things that I already talked about. And so if we want to look at, what are the best areas for wind, what are the best areas of fishing, and then can we overlay those together, we can do what we call build spatial suitability models. So I've been building some spatial suitability models to calculate the net present value of looking at where we should develop wind, basically. How much is cost changing over as you increase both depth and increase distance from shore, because those are really two of the major drivers when we think about cabling, when we think about installing, we think about turbine type. Right? So we can build models to help us understand essentially the cost of development in any given space of the ocean. And what we've done here is we've actually calculated how much it would cost to build a wind farm, right, that is centered in one of these squares. And these squares are the planning unit here in the US. We call them Outer Continental Shelf lease blocks. And so we can use these as a way to identify which areas are more expensive and by how much, right? So this would tell us we want to prioritize clearly areas that are green, right? Least cost areas. Costs tend to be passed on to ratepayers. So the more expensive the wind farm is, the more expensive the electricity is going to be, right? And just for your reference, I overlaid at the time some of the wind energy areas that the federal government was considering leasing out, right? So we can see, have we leased out our wind energy areas in good places or not? And then we can look at fishing data to say, well, where is fishing taking place? Here in the US, any vessel that's fishing in federal waters is going to be submitting a daily report back to the federal government. This is a confidential data set, but it can be accessed if you have funding, like government grant funding. And you can look at all of these different fishing records from every single vessel landing over any time period that you would like. So they're daily reports. And we tend to think of these not just sort of in aggregate, but we might look at them on a species by species or fishery by fishery level. And we do that because we know that impacts to fishing are going to be different if you're dredging, trawling, using pots, right, or traps, right? So the impacts are different because of the way that vessels are sort of navigating over ocean space. Also, depending on where the center of that fishery is, some fisheries are more likely to interact with wind farms than others. Right? So this is just an example. We said, well, let's look at the clam industry and pair that and see if we have conflict with the clam industry and offshore wind. So using all of those vessel trip records, we can say, well, this is where the clam industry is really aggregated. These are the most important areas, right? These red areas. Okay, so those would be clear areas that we should minimize. Okay, and then we can do what we call a conflict analysis and come up with maps that show us, well, where do we have high value in the fishery and high value for wind farms? Okay, so anything that's sort of in this red zone here means it's a good wind area, right? And then the darker colors correspond to good fishing areas. The takeaway is we see some conflict, right, in some of these zones. And so these would be areas that we might flag as these are going to be challenging areas to develop because we're having a high conflict in these particular lease areas. So we can go to those individual fishermen. We could avoid those areas altogether, right? There's a lot of information that we can generate from these types of analyses. So these can be really useful planning tools. And if we combine lots of fisheries together, we can identify specific areas that might be high conflict, moderate conflict, or very little or no conflict. Okay. So I wanted to share that as a way for us to think about not just what do people think about wind, how can we start to avoid conflict? Well, of course, we know that we can't always avoid conflict, right? We might need to be working together if we're trying to share the very same space. And so how can we move together towards kind of a shared sense of shared set of solutions? Right? If fisheries community members are participating in research, can this lead to better coexistence outcomes? So I wanted to just sort of pivot here to talk a little bit about some studies that we're working on that have direct fisheries participation and interactions to not only improve sort of knowledge base and opportunities for public engagement, but also to empower fishing community members to feel like they know sort of how and when to be able to participate in these not very transparent processes. Right. So the study I'm going to share a little bit about is a federally funded study called Informed Engagement with Maine Fishing Communities using virtual offshore wind farms. And this has been kind of a neat project because we've taken an innovative approach to doing community work to seeing what those technical solutions might be, right? So what we're doing here is going into fishing communities and villages, and through kind of an in-depth interview, we've built a virtual reality model of one of the proposed offshore wind farms here in Maine. And we wanted to understand about how attitudes and how attitudes might change among members and individuals in the fishing industry. But we also wanted to know, are there changes in design of the wind farm that might improve fishing access? So we actually modified the wind farm in virtual reality so people could get direct experience. Most people have not had the opportunity to go steam near an offshore wind farm, right? So we wanted to give people as close to direct experience as possible to understand, are there technical solutions to help enable what you might call coexistence, right? So typically, I even showed you some of these earlier. Researchers tend to use these static visualizations. You have all seen different types of static visualizations, I'm sure, but they don't give you a real sense of what it's like to be in a wind farm. So we built this virtual reality environment where people would put on a VR headset and they would get to interact with a wind farm. 5 miles from shore, which is really about the distance at which on a typical day in Maine, you might be able to see the wind farm. And then we put people down on the beach, we put people on a boat, and then they iteratively got closer to the wind farm so they could see this. And then we asked people's questions about what they were thinking and what are their attitudes and perceptions. And we did this with members of fishing industry themselves, as well as fishing managers and folks like harbor masters and people who are running marinas and wharfs and whatnot. Right. So I'm going to show you a quick video clip. It's not the same as being in virtual reality, and some of you may have been in virtual reality and maybe others hadn't, but this will just give you a picture. So we just took a video recording of our computer screen, but in reality, in VR, you have on a headset, which is fully immersive. People truly feel like they're in the environment. But I'll give you this 1-minute clip. You may need to turn the sound up on your computer because there is actually audio that people could hear as well. So in the video, people have been already placed from the cliff into the boat, and we're asking them to look at the wind farm, and we're asking them questions as they're in this scene looking at the wind farm. Turning around, you can see the back of the vessel, right? So we built this whole environment. There's an island. We tried to make it look like Maine, although not any one particular location in Maine. The fishermen like to tell us that the water was far too calm and too blue. So we're going to fix that for our next model. But when we had a very active ocean, it made people seasick when they were in the virtual reality. So we had to keep the sea pretty calm. You can see we're getting closer. And you can start to hear the wind turbines. It'll take you just a little bit closer in just a minute. About 400 feet from the wind farm. This is all spatially accurate and built to specifications that we worked on with government partners and using government reports. So I wanted to share that because this is a new way of working with fishing community members on starting to identify more solutions that might be more technical. So in that, you got to move closer to the wind farm, but what you didn't get to see is that we put the wind turbines in different arrays, configurations. We put in transit lanes and asked if that changed people's attitudes at all, and what are some of the technical risks. When we look at the fishermen themselves as a set, we found that having the transit lane was generally preferred, but people didn't really feel like they would be enabled to still fish within that wind farm. They felt like there was still going to be a pretty big barrier when seas were not optimal, right? So a lot of people had preconceived ideas about the aesthetics of the wind farm. And we've asked people kind of how big they thought the wind turbines would look and sort of to form this picture in their mind. And what we really found is people had, I would say, largely inaccurate frames of reference of what they thought the wind farm would look like compared to what it actually would look and sort of feel like. We also found that we didn't change opinions. So adding different configurations and asking if you could fish within these arrays, it didn't really affect whether or not people had positive or negative attitudes towards the wind farms. So people sort of, talked about things that they liked and things that they didn't. But for the most part, if people started out in opposition of wind energy, they continued to be in opposition of wind energy, although they largely did like having transit lanes. Most people, actually, no people talked about being able to continue their fishing activities within a wind farm, no matter how you configure it, right? Using virtual reality is also very cool. And there is, in the research community, a concern that people might share more positive attitudes because of something called VR glow. But we didn't find that to be the case. People actually had fairly negative and stayed negative about wind farms overall. So those are just a few of the different projects that I wanted to highlight. And I wanted to leave you with some takeaways from what we talked about, and then transition into some ideas for sort of where the research community is going and what government might be able to do to help enable more and facilitate more conversations around what it means to have coexistence. So I think first, I wanted to share that it's really important that we recognize that when people are opposed, particularly in working waterfronts and fishing communities, when they're opposed to wind farms, it's not really about NIMBY, and it's not opposition for opposition's sake. There's a lot of issues that come up that are really important, and I think it's really important to recognize the value of things like maintaining fishing access for future generations, or honoring access to an area that one's grandparents or past generations have implemented. Those are really important values for people, right? And community benefits is something that is promoted a lot as a way to mitigate for that. And there are some studies that are looking into more that are specific to fishing communities and looking at community benefits. I would encourage you to explore that if you're interested. But it doesn't really mitigate for this sort of socially constructed value that we have about the ocean as a pristine environment. Lots of fishermen tell us, this is why they have this job. They want to be out on the water. It's really important. They're protecting, future resources. They really find that their role in the seafood economy and providing food for families and food for community members to be really important and valuable. So honoring that, I think, is first and foremost. We also can identify themes of what I'm going to call energy injustice. And I didn't really define this at the beginning of the presentation, though certainly this has been in lots of popular media lately. But we can really sort of bucket a lot of the concerns that we see in fishing communities, specifically around both procedural and distributive injustice. So procedural injustice meaning decision-making processes are felt to be unfair and not transparent. And an example of that is what I showed at the beginning of sort of these large maps and people not knowing when there's an opportunity to have a say, or maybe meetings are held at times when people need to be out fishing or whatnot. right? So the process is not transparent, and that makes it feel very unfair. And there's also this distributive challenge where the benefits and the burdens are felt to not be evenly distributed or fairly distributed, right? So some communities are bearing a larger impact. And in this case, certainly here in Maine, fishing community has been quite vocal in their concerns that they're bearing a larger burden than is fair. Right. Some of the uncertainty and lack of transparency certainly related to the first point that I made, but more specific of how the leasing process is happening, wind farm design, wind farm layout. Many of these decisions are not made until very late in the process once a lease has been issued to a private developer, right? So it makes it very hard to engage in these processes without knowing what's actually coming, right? So what information is even important to share. So I'll talk just for a moment about some of the next steps that we're working on to help get us towards coexistence. So I'm an academic, so I work on obviously academic research, but there's a lot of other researchers, well, not a lot, there are some other researchers in this space looking at what are some of the operational constraints for fishing communities around, in my case, I'm interested in floating wind because that's what we have here, but certainly fixed-based as well. And then how will operational changes because of a wind farm impact a marine dependent community and local workforce? And a study that was recently funded that I'm working on is we're developing, when we were in our virtual reality study, people told us, well, it's great to see what's above the water, but we really need to know what's happening under the water, right? So we're building that underwater wind farm in partnership with our government partners who have the technical specifications so that fishermen can actually place their gear alongside the mooring lines of a floating wind farm and like experience what that interaction will be like underwater before these wind farms are built, right? And so this is a challenging space that we're working in. People have created underwater environments before, but we're really excited. We just launched this project just a few weeks ago and have a really committed advisory board. And this one is really important to me because we're partnered with a number of fishing industry community members, and fishermen themselves are both driving what they want to see in this model, as well as the outreach. We're going to be deploying this at fishing industry trade shows so that we can sort of use this as a educational and knowledge building tool. We also have government-led solutions that I think are important to note. And I sort of touched on this a moment ago, but public engagement processes are not felt to be fair in many cases and instances. This is certainly not universally true, but we need to be, I think, aware that there can be a lot of uncertainty about these development processes and some of the power inequities that are perceived, right? So there are power differentials. Many people in, let's say, fishing community feel that the wind industry has quite a lot of power and influence. It's a very high value industry. And then perceived lack of transparency continues to lead to distrust. And so the way that the state of Maine has been dealing with this has been through the development of the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative. One of the things that we've done, and I say we because I did participate, I volunteered on one of the working groups. We have a 10-year offshore wind strategy that was led by the Governor's Energy Office, and this came with capacity building grants. And I think this was important because part of the 10-year strategy included a working group on fisheries. And this brought together and gave sort of voting power to fishermen themselves and representatives of fishing industry groups, as well as other managers to talk about, what is it that we see that we're concerned about and what kinds of information do we want to be on the public record for the sort of the strategy moving forward. Okay. In addition to that 10-year plan, we also have a research array that was identified. I'll show you a map of that in just a moment. We have planning goals that were identified. So how much of different energy types do we want to see? This was also supported by a legislative procurement target, which was signed on. So in part of the legislative action included support to develop a port, as well as it built in labor standards and it built in legislation to avoid key lobster fishing areas. So it put in sort of a moratorium on inshore lobster fishing, and that was I think considered a win. And then finally, the development of what we call this research array. This is meant to be developed by the state. And so this is Gulf of Maine, of course, and this is the research array. And the idea is that there's going to be different types of both social, ecological, and technical research that will take place before commercial development is happening. Now, certainly there are some concerns that the research array won't be built very much before the commercial leasing will take place. That may be true, but that's the intent of having this research array and some of these funding resources attached to that. And related to the research array is the development of what we call the Offshore Wind Research Consortium, which I understand is an area of interest in some areas of Canada as well. And the research consortium, I'm actually a co-chair of this research group with a fisherman community member. What this does is it establishes a group which specifies in public law the number of fishermen that must be on the board at any given time, as well as other people that need to be involved. It included funding to support prioritization. These are voted on, so every consortium member has a direct voting access to what types of research projects do we want to include. And I wanted to also note that the initial round of funding that was included, it was just solicited back in December of last year, included a study for us to define and explore solutions for fisheries and offshore wind coexistence. So this is very much kind of the hot topic, I think, of the day. And the last thing I really wanted to say is that as we're starting to think about, I guess, coexistence or co-location or whatever we might want to call it, it really requires time and trust to build relationships. And there's a lot of concern about performative outreach, meaning outreach for the sake of checking a box without really taking the time to develop meaningful relationships. So I think that cannot be overstated, how important it is to build solutions that are built on trusted relationships, right? That it really takes time to do this. I also wanted to note that I think it's really important that fishing community members are given the opportunity to have engagement opportunities that have voting power. Sometimes I call this veto power, right? Just having conversations that tend not to be two-way are not always that useful, right? And in fact, as was the case in Rhode Island, right? A lot of these engagements can feel like kind of a waste of time if the fishermen themselves are not being given the power to say yes to something and no to something else, right? So I think that that's important. And then solutions should really be co-designed with the community members that are affected. So that might be fishermen, or it might be some other user group. And it's important to have trusted institutions and collaborators. That includes capacity building. And by capacity building, part of that certainly includes funding. All right, so I'm going to end there and happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison. And I think I had told you when we were talking about this webinar, we're at the very, very early stages of a lot of this. So that a lot of the lessons and things that you're doing, I think, are just, I found extremely interesting because we're thinking about all these things. And so just to kick it off, one question I had was just around like the work that you're doing with the fishing industry. Just curious, because as we're thinking of like how we design some of these engagement activities and how, I guess the easiest way to put it is how willing have they been to participate in some of the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that I think as an academic institution with no real stake in the game, it has made it easier to work with fishing community members. I think that there is a lot of distrust that is more deeply rooted in other matters, right? There's there can be distrust from maybe past engagements, and that's not only true with fishing community, right? That's true of many communities. So I do think that identifying trusted partners and maybe institutions as sort of an intermediate, I think can be really important. And who that trusted community member is, whether it's academic or not, really does vary, depending on the region. So I think that that would be an important goal setting. But we've had really wonderful interactions with fishing community members who, they tell a lot of people who are telling us, we want to engage, but the ways that have been offered previously haven't felt successful. So trying to come up with more solutions to help those engagements feel positive and two-way and meaningful.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think some of what you said too about just ensuring the processes are very transparent so that people know when they can participate and what kinds of things they're going to be participating in, I think is a really good just principle for, everybody to be thinking about. Actually on that, I had one other question. I'm going to go to the audience. And actually, I will say to all attendees, please feel free to ask questions. I have a few in the Q&A that I'll follow up on. But before we get to that, one other question I had, and this is just kind of technical. When you had shown the kind of the conflict area mapping, I think it was towards the beginning of your presentation, I was curious of whether or not that kind of analysis was done by government as well, like when they were identifying the wind energy areas. And basically what I'm wondering is like, when does the fishing industry, or when did they in Maine at least have the opportunity to kind of shape or provide input into that process?
Yeah. So there can be parallel opportunities. So some government does do some of their own sort of deconflicting analyses. And I think there were a lot of lessons learned from what started in sort of the mid-Atlantic and regions further south to when they got to the Gulf of Maine. When the federal government got to the Gulf of Maine to do this sort of winnowing down process, they did a number of fisheries-specific engagements. And I will say there was some frustration, I think, in that process. But one of the outcomes led to an entire, what we call LMA1, or Lobster Management Area 1. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's one of the major fishing grounds in Maine. Basically everything near shore ended up being excluded from the leasing areas. So that's maybe a little beyond the question that you specifically asked, but those engagements had enough teeth that the federal government removed quite a lot of the areas that they had been considering for development. And I think that that was considered a win for some members of the lobster fishery. Of course, what that means is now all of the development is concentrated in areas where there's other fishing taking place. So there's always trade-offs to those solutions.
Right. Okay. No, that's helpful. Just we're at that stage right now, really, in Atlantic Canada, where they're identifying potential areas. So it's just helpful to know what other places have done and how, the fishing industry has provided input into that. Going to the Q&A, one of the questions, and I had this same question when you were going through it. So when you went through the perceptions and kind of some of the factors that impacted, certain perceptions, one of them, I think one of them was higher education leading to lower support. And that one seemed really interesting to me because I think sometimes you would think otherwise, just because some people would be following climate change more closely or that kind of thing. Is there anything like you can add to that just to help us understand it a bit better?
Yeah, absolutely. That on the face was a surprise to us in that study as well. But the more we looked into the context around those responses, people this is just a statistical model that's developing these linkages, right? So when we dig into that grouping of people that had higher than a bachelor's degree, people tended to be very skeptical that this was the right solution because it's expensive and many of them perceived lower hanging fruit to get to our energy goals. So it's not that offshore wind is bad, but it's that maybe there's better ways like efficiency, right? Maybe there is lower hanging fruit or cheaper options or less fraught or contested solutions that we should be approaching before we start moving to what's really quite an extensive, ocean development project, right? There's a lot involved. And so, we don't have developed supply chains. So in some cases, I think people knew a lot about it and thought that, well, maybe this isn't the best choice.
Yeah, no, I could see that. We get that question a lot. Like, why not just focus on onshore or solar where the costs are lower and people know more about the technologies? So I can understand that for sure. Another question that came in was, what opportunities are there for offshore wind to build a mutual economy with fishermen? What types of jobs, training, positive habitat changes? And this actually leads into a question I also had, is just like, what are fishermen's, like their fishing industry's attitude towards even that kind of thing, like how offshore wind could benefit them?
Yeah. So I guess to answer the first part of that question, there are workforce studies that have looked at what are the job transfer skills and what are the trainings required. And so I'm not super familiar with the nuance of those, but I would direct who's asking the question to look for some of those. And the state of Maine did one very recently, and they looked quite extensively. I could send that to you if that's helpful. They looked at the workforce needs and like basically matching skill sets and matching areas. Um, I, I can't speak on behalf of how all fishermen might perceive this, but I can say that my engagements have shown that this is met with quite a lot of resistance, because fishing is, as it's been described to me, very important culturally, and working on a different industry is not an acceptable solution. It's not a substitute. There's very strong generational and cultural value in that. So on paper, I think that we tend to point to a lot of studies that show that there is quite, there's a lot of opportunity. And certainly in the surveying that's happening in the Atlantic coast, a lot of fishing vessels have been employed for doing those surveys, right? So they have a lot of, clearly they have a lot of experience on the water. So there's can be partnership built that way. And here in Maine, at least in the research consortium, we built into the RFP requirements that any of the studies, the baseline studies that would be conducted, were required to work with existing Maine fishermen to do those studies. So those are some ways of, small ways of building partnership. But I do think that new jobs is something that gets suggested a lot. And I'm not sure that we're at a place right now where that's being very well received.
It sounds like it kind of comes back to your observation that this is also very cultural, like people have an attachment to this, to fishing and to the ocean. And so they may not want to see themselves in a new role or displaced from what they were doing. Yes,
Yeah,
that's
that's right.
understandable. One quick question here, just technical, around the virtual reality. So,
Mhm.
what was the distance between turbines in the VR study? Was it a kilometer?
No, it was a
Okay,
mile.
a mile. Okay,
Yep.
that's helpful. And
Yep.
the follow-up to that was, do you feel it would make a difference if the distance was larger in terms of of fishermen's perceptions of it?
Yeah, we did try that. Actually, that was one of the modifications we made to the environment, is we spread everything out and we put people in the middle of the wind farm, and they were much farther away. Now, if we had started it with them being farther away, we didn't do that as a control, so maybe, but people had a really sort of visceral and emotional reaction to the virtual environment, which was mostly related to safety at sea and whether or not their vessel would be safe even transiting through, much less operating near. We heard a lot of stories about, if an engine goes out, or, things that could be catastrophic, that the risk wasn't really worth it. So when we talked to people about adding in larger spacing in the turbines, what we heard was a transit area would be great, but the more distance you have, the more footprint of the ocean is being taken up. And so it certainly wasn't like a silver bullet solution, I wouldn't say. Yeah.
And I'm going to use this as the last question because it's just kind of a segue or the last one was a segue into this one. Did any fishing industry members indicate if anything would convince them that they could operate within wind farms in the future, or was exclusion seen as the only possible outcome?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say we've been really carefully scouring our data set. We just conducted these studies less than a year ago. So we're still digging in, but we were hoping that we would get more information about technical solutions And we haven't gotten to the point where we've really identified what those solutions might be, other than people felt like if they could see what their gear was like underwater, what that spread of the mooring systems would be, that would really enable them to have a better sense of what the possibilities were going to be. And so people did talk about, well, you might be able to long line here, or you might be able to, name like there may be some fishing activities that could continue, but some of the fishing activities, let's say the large trawling vessels for groundfish, thought, well, my gear's just too big, or, the potential for the mooring lines is just not going to enable that possibility. So I think that people are receptive to that idea, and that's, the state right now is funding some research in that area. And I do think in the federal government here in the US is very interested in the answer to that question. But I don't know that we've really come up with I would love to have a great answer for that.
Yeah. No,
but I don't think we've come up with it yet. I think that is an area of research that is very much needed.
yeah. Okay. Well, we'll keep watching too as you go forward with that, because I think there'll be a lot of interest here too as we're developing policies and guidance and all the work that has to get done. So we're at our time. So I just really want to thank you, Alison, for being here with us. That was really interesting and very helpful for the work that's happening right now in Canada. So thank you so much. I also want to thank all of our attendees for joining us. As I mentioned, we'll have a recording of the webinar, but if there's anything that you also want to follow up on, please feel free to get in touch with me or anyone at Marine Renewables Canada, because we can provide some additional information possibly. And then the last thing I'll let everyone know is our next webinar is going to be in the fall. The topic is to be determined. So if you have any interesting things you really want to hear about, please feel free to get in touch with us, but otherwise stay tuned. And thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon. Thanks. Bye, Alison.
Thank you. Bye.